Hello everyone, Guillaume Netsman here, host of the E-Commerce Wizards podcast, where I feature leaders in e-commerce and business. Today's guest for a second short episode is Josh Ward, VP of Sales at Nexcess Hosting, and we'll be talking about how to improve the performance of your Adobe Commerce, also known as Magento, e-commerce hosting performance.
This episode is brought to you by MageMontreal. If a business wants a powerful e-commerce online store that will increase their sales, or to move piled up inventory to free up cash reserves, or to automate business processes to reduce human processing errors, our company, MageMontreal, can do that. We've been helping e-commerce stores for over a decade. Here's the catch. We're specialized and only work on the Adobe Magento e-commerce platform, also known as Adobe Commerce. We're among only a handful of certified companies in Canada. We do everything Magento related. If you know someone who needs design, support, training, maintenance, or a new e-commerce website, email our team at support@MageMontreal.com or go to MageMontreal.com. That's MAGE Montreal.com.
So without further ado, let's just jump right into the topic. Josh, how do you go about optimizing the hosting performance of an Adobe Commerce or Magento hosting?
Yeah, happy to be chatting again, Guillaume. That's great. Where to start? I think if I work sort of top down, the first thing I might look at is how are you leveraging a CDN? I think that's a really important piece, and sometimes overlooked. CDN can cover a lot of evils from an optimization standpoint. Certainly not unique to Nexcess, but image compression tools. Just distribution of static files. I mean, all of those things cover. It just really reduces the load that any traffic has on your sort of primary hosting setup, right? So it means you buy less resources from me, and you put assets closer to the visitor, right? And we see that as a win-win. That's good for everybody. So CDN is really important, and like I said, it makes everybody's life a little bit easier. So that's a biggie. From there, there's just there's fine tuning in the LAMP stack in general, right? The way you're running PHP, the way you're going to run Apache, those are all the tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Magento sites at this point that we've worked on. We have a nice little recipe that we can start with to make that LAMP stack as efficient as possible, right? We have put Apache and Nginx are one of those areas where we have put them through their paces several dozen times, and we have just found Apache a little bit more compatible with some other things that we use, other tooling and things that we use. And when it's fully optimized, when it's not just out of the box, it's about as performative as Nginx is. Like we don't feel like the ease of use trade-off is worth the just the little bit of performance enhancements that we get. And so that's really important to us, right? These are the things that we kind of think about on a daily basis.
So Apache wins by a slim margin.
From a performance standpoint, Nginx, I would tell you Nginx probably wins by a slim margin, but ease of use, Apache, ease of use and compatibility, Apache wins. And so it's, it covers that performance win for Nginx isn't enough to convince us that that's what we should be using.
All right. So we got CDN, obviously. So it could be Cloudflare, Varnish, whatever else you want, Amazon CDN. Sorry, not Varnish. I meant Fastly. Of course, then on the caching, you have stuff like Varnish. If you want to cover also a little bit that point on the Magento side of the caching.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll start with Redis because it's sort of the easy one, right? Your static caching there. We've I don't think we can do anything without Redis. And so Redis is kind of where it starts, but Varnish is the fun piece, right? Varnish is the sort of the more dynamic piece there. We approach Varnish kind of in two ways, right? So for the bulk of our, especially with Magento 2, the bulk of our customers on a fairly fairly similar websites. We just kind of use Varnish as a plug and play, right? If you rewind back to 2014, 2015, Varnish implementation was super complicated. There's a lot of
Magento 1 or Magento 2 or both?
Magento 1.
Yeah, that was a nightmare.
It was super complicated. Thankfully, a lot less complicated now with Magento 2. And so, we provide some pretty basic VCLs that are really plug and play, and you squeeze, 80% of the Varnish goodness, and then you don't have to do the 20% of the work to sort of get the rest of the way there, right? So we leverage Varnish in a really general way for most of our sites, right? Which I think is really helpful for smaller Magento sites, that they can kind of flip a switch and now they have the power of Varnish at their hands, right? Now, at the higher end, right, we're working with enterprise customers. We still get really custom with Varnish, right? Work with them to get really custom and squeeze 100% of the juice out of what Varnish has to offer, and so that's great. And then we do actually leverage Nginx as sort of a proxy in front of. So if you've got one of our Magento cloud packages, we run Nginx and leverage micro caching, and it just sort of sits out in front of your single VM, right? I mean, your store's running in a single cloud instance. And then Nginx is sitting, just right in front of Apache, filtering out requests, and if it's got anything in its micro cache, it'll provide that. And if not, the request goes straight onto the VM, right? So that Magento handles it however it deems necessary, and that helps a lot. I mean, that alleviates, sort of alleviates maybe 30% of the server load. That's an average, right? But just running that traffic through micro caching it alleviates about 30% of the server load. It doesn't really require any additional configuration from a customer standpoint or on our end, and it doesn't keep things in cache long enough to cause any sort of weird, like you can flush it, but a lot of times if you push a new update, you don't even have to flush the micro cache. It's going to kind of flush itself naturally and quickly enough to where it's not not sort of one of those things that you have to constantly remember it's there, and you have to account for as you're doing development, which is nice.
And since we're being very technical, do you want to explain like what you define as micro cache? What's part of that?
Yeah, so just it essentially micro cache would be something. It's like less than 30 seconds, right? So the pages that it holds in memory only last for 30 seconds. And so if you've got one visitor every 5 minutes, micro cache is not playing a big role in your performance, right? Because it's already, by the time your second visitor comes through, it's already cleared the cache. But if all of a sudden you get a spike to landing page, right? You have a marketing campaign that just takes off. And it's this one that you didn't expect, and all of a sudden you've got 100 visitors to that one page. Well, micro cache sees that, right? So it's refreshing like I said, every 30 seconds. And as that page gets served, it gets cached, and then it sits there. And so if people just keep hammering it, then micro cache just holds onto that page. And when your traffic subsides and it goes back down to normal levels, where maybe you've got a new visitor every 60 seconds. Micro cache clears itself. It's not using any more resources. And it's waiting for the next event. So it's like I said, it's a great, it's a great little kind of side piece, right? It's not a fix for everything. But it does help you as maybe you've primed Redis to focus on these 10 pages, right? You sort of said, hey, I want Redis to cache these all the time. But your traffic spike comes from over here, right? Micro cache kind of bridges that gap, lets Redis catch up, start caching this other page, and you're back. You're off to the races.
Okay. Well, another frequent question would be, how do I plan for a traffic spike? If I know in advance and I know I'm going to spend 4 times more before Black Friday, I guess I can have a chat with my hosting company and say, hey, can my site handle like that kind of traffic and ad campaign? But what if you get like an unexpected, exposure in the marketing way that is good, sending you lots of traffic, how do you plan for that, or how do you react to that to be able to, benefit from it and not just being down or super slow? Or
Yeah. There's right. So I would say there's multiple things to consider, and it's always kind of a cost benefit, right? How likely is something to happen? Sometimes when you're talking about capacity, right, planning for traffic spikes, you're kind of talking about insurance, right? Like how much insurance do I want to buy? I don't want to be overinsured, but I also don't want to be caught in a bad situation. So yeah, so we would handle that in a couple of ways, right? There's a scenario where your VM doesn't resize, right? It doesn't actually get bigger or smaller, but we just provide additional resources on the fly to handle that spike, right? Additional resources so that you can increase the amount of PHP processes you're running, and then when it subsides, then it sort of goes back down to normal, right? This idea of sort of auto scaling, right? Now, it certainly has its upper limits. Another option would be I resize my VM, right? Still single VM, right? One server. I've got a spike. I need to get bigger, but you have to reboot, right? The downside there is that for a few minutes your site's gonna be down, so that when it comes back, it's got more resources and it can be up and be performative. And so that's kind of a trade-off there. Another way that we, if you kind of break out of the single, right, I've got a single server or single VM, and what do I do when I get a traffic spike, is, we still rely pretty heavily on bare metal solutions at the enterprise level, right? Our larger customers are still running in clustered architecture on physical servers. One of the ways that we, combat sort of, what these unexpected spikes is we just always have, we own and operate the data centers. And so we just always have hardware sitting there kind of, what we call permascaled, right? So if we think customer comes to us and we go, well, you need 4 front-end servers, but sometimes we think you need 5 or 6, then we just include that extra capacity, right? Because you don't need to always run 6 servers maybe, but you always need them there just in case. And so we'll include some additional servers that aren't, going to be an additional cost, or at least certainly not a significant additional cost, and just have them there as a, like I said, just as like a just in case, right? So if we erred on our calculations, if you underestimated how effective your marketing efforts were going to be, if one of us were wrong or we were both wrong or whatever it was, we want to make sure that there's some additional capacity there, because we can't, you can't turn on hardware immediately if you don't have it racked and ready to go. So we kind of make sure that's the case. And then the third way is just, when we virtualize clusters, right? So when we move that enterprise architecture into a cloud environment, and then you've got load balanced, VMs all over the place, then you can scale vertically, right? You can make each one of those VMs bigger. You can add more of them, right? There's, you have a lot more options as you start to virtualize that. You kind of go from there. Planning is always best if you can. Planning is always best, but we've learned, we've worked with brands, and I'm not going to name any specific names, but we had a couple instances I remember back in, I think it was like 2017, 2018 timeframe, where we had a customer, and there was a news story, something had happened, and then it was, all the news networks and everything, and they weren't the focus of the news story. The company wasn't, but their product was part of what had happened. It was, it had been mentioned in all these news stories, and they just got a flood of traffic, right? And that's not related to their marketing. This was traffic that wasn't buying their product. It was just like, oh, what's this product that's mentioned in this news story, right? And so they would get a flood of traffic, and we had a couple of those instances, I remember, and that's kind of where this permascaled, process came from. Is we're like, oh, you never know, right? When a customer is big enough, you sort of never know what's gonna cause these spikes, and so how can we help them prepare for it? So Yeah, just we kind of help do that capacity planning as a just in case, and I think we've gotten pretty good at figuring out what's needed there.
Okay, so we've covered obviously the scalability, which is an important part of having an optimized hosting performance. You don't want to have a slowdown or a downtime there. You did cover already about CDN and leveraging caching, right, as Varnish, and so on. You talk about right sizing to not like overpay or underpay, just to right size your hosting hardware there and capacity. I can think also, of course, of cron jobs that perhaps we could cover on, and any other ideas that you have. If we could run through like a bullet point checklist of ideas here to optimize the hosting.
Yeah. So crons are great. When you run your cron jobs, is sort of the maybe how many you run and when you run them becomes really important. Those are things we typically like to address in the migration process, because that, if you're running a bunch of cron jobs to update product SKUs in the middle of the day when most of your customers are buying from you, that's not great. And so we have to figure out how best to handle that. How necessary are those crons to run. That leads, anything database related. I think a lot of folks don't. They think a little bit less about what sort of third-party systems do they have plugged in that are reading and writing things to their database. Right, might be an ERP, whatever sort of inventory system or PIM that they might be using, whatever it is. We've seen a bunch of different things there, but that's potentially also a choke point for resources, and there's ways that we can plan for that without. You could change some things with your business, or we could just architect the solution a little bit differently, or some combination to overcome that. Certainly, admin users is another piece, right? Magento 2 way better at handling admin users than Magento 1 was, but we still run into customers whose their sales departments, their fulfillment departments, sometimes their customer service departments are all logged into the back end of Magento at the same time that orders are coming in. And all those users are, really dependent on server resources. And then, so how do we sort of, how do we kind of fence off, here's all your internal users and here's their resources. And then here's your visitors, right? That becomes another one. Balancing redundancy with performance, especially from a database standpoint, is always really important. We never want to, having two database servers is great, but making sure that you're, as you're as you're writing to the secondary database, you're also not sacrificing performance on your primary database. That becomes a really important balancing act, and knowing when and if you should add a third database into the mix and cluster that. But yeah, it's much sort of kind of bigger build, bigger consideration.
Yeah, that's huge build. And how would you split the database? Like, would say, oh, I want, like, I don't know, customers here, orders there, or how do you split it? What's the decision how to split the database when it gets really huge?
Yeah, so a couple of considerations. One, like you said, like which tables might you split out, and that's based on what needs the most resources or needs the most dedicated resources, right? If you've got a bunch of new accounts coming in, right, from a customer standpoint, but not a lot of sales. Let's say you're a wholesaler or something, and so people are browsing pricing and they need to more B2B and they're calling in to place orders, or who knows, lots of scenarios. But yeah, it's gonna be based on sort of the business use, and a little bit less on, hey, this is how we always do it. And then there's always just being able to just kind of replication with 3 servers, even if you're not splitting tables off across those 3. When you have 3 servers and you're trying to do some sort of real-time replication there, you're gonna lose a lot less performance with 3 than you would with 2, right? You can get, with 3 database servers, you can get way more, you get much closer to real-time replication than you can with 2 without sacrificing performance, right? To get real-time with 2 database servers, replication across 2 servers, you have to sacrifice performance on your primary, because it's receiving writes and it's providing information back to the system, but then it's also replicating itself over here, and so you take some performance hits. When you have 3, I'm not a database architect, so I don't understand all the things, but when you have 3, you're able to do that in a way more efficient route, where essentially you have like two primary database servers, and they're taking turns writing to the secondary type of setup. So yeah, we don't have a ton of customers that are running that.
No, you have to be huge to need to like shard databases or stuff like that, but there's demand for that sometimes. Yeah. Cool. So that's a pretty good coverage. So just again, like anything else top of mind to optimize hosting performance?
You know, I not to do this to you again, but I'm always going to point back, on the development piece, right?
Sure.
Work with a great developer, because the better your code, the more efficient your code is, the less uniqueness you need from me as a hosting company, and that's going to save you money and time and effort in the long run, right? Paying a little bit more upfront to work with somebody like yourself pays huge dividends in the long run, right? Your total cost of ownership, I think goes away.
Big time, because in the worst case scenario we've seen, like say, oh, how long is it going to be to do that change there? Well, okay, let's say 4 hours in a normal setup, but then it's built so terribly that's like, no, actually it's going to be like a day and a half. It's 3 times the time because it's a spaghetti, that thing. It's so terrible, and then of course it impacts loading, it impacts the experience for the user, and so on. Another one there is the Google Core Vital Score. That's very popular since that came out not that long ago. Don't go crazy about chasing the 100% score. Just like improve it a lot, because that doesn't give you sales. It's just one ranking signal among many for Google to give you a better ranking on Google, that will give you some sales or some traffic through SEO. So, but it is definitely an important one, especially that the user truly feels that it's a quick site. When you click, you feel like it's fast, more than having a score.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that's some pretty good one. Let's think of anything else. Think we can wrap up this episode here.
Yeah,
yeah.
I think I'm good.
Okay. So Josh, if somebody wants to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Yeah, drop me an email, jward, JWARD @nexcess.net. And I am Josh D. Ward on most social platforms. LinkedIn's probably my favorite, so feel free to connect there, and yeah, that'd be great.
All right. Thanks for being here today, Josh.
Thank you. Have a great one.